When the Mongols came to India in 1299, they did not come as raiders sniffing for easy gold. They came as a verdict, a moving judgment already feared from China to Persia. From the ruins of cities nobody had believed could fall from roads lined with the memory of kingdoms that had discovered too late that courage alone cannot stop a system built for speed, hunger, and annihilation. At the head of this wave stood Kutlug Khwaja, son of Dua Khan, advancing toward Delhi, not merely to plunder, but to break the one great state in northern India that still imagined it could resist the heirs of Genghis Khan. Villages emptied, caravans vanished. Smoke climbed into the sky in long black columns. The panic was not irrational. The Mongols had already taught the world what happened to those who faced them unprepared. They moved faster than ordinary armies. They carried little because they meant to feed on the land itself. They did not politely besiege prosperity. They devoured it. So the real question before Delhi was not whether the enemy was dangerous. It was whether a kingdom threatened by the greatest military predator on earth could survive by thinking differently enough to become unappetizing. That is the heart of this story. Not the glory of one charge, not the romance of one heroic duel, but the colder truth that sometimes the deadliest weapon in war is not steel at all. It is administration. It is grain. It is price. It is control so total that an invading army arrives expecting abundance and instead finds a landscape already turned against it. That king was Alauddin Khalji, and he understood something. Most rulers only discover while losing an empire is not defended first at the battlefield. It is defended in the granary, the tax register, the supply road, the payroll ledger, the market stall, and the village, whose harvest either exists when the army needs it or has already been hidden before the enemy can reach it. This is why Alauddin matters. He was not simply a brave sultan standing in front of a gate with a sword raised. He was a ruler who looked at the Mongol problem and saw that cavalry could not be answered by heroics alone. The Mongols were too fast for conventional improvisation, too mobile for sluggish feudal responses, too practiced at feeding themselves off conquered land. So he began building something stranger and more durable. A war state financed so tightly that chance itself would have less room to breathe. Prices fixed, grain controlled, markets watched, soldiers registered, salaries standardized. Corruption attacked not because moral purity suddenly interested him, but because corruption was leakage, and leakage in a frontier state facing Mongols becomes death. Many chroniclers hated him for this. They called it tyranny, and from the perspective of those squeezed by it, that word was not wrong. But tyrannical or not, the system worked toward one purpose with terrible clarity. It allowed Delhi to sustain a large standing military force, not for a campaign season, but as a permanent instrument. Around 70,000 professional soldiers, we are told in the transcripts, frame, along with roughly 700 war elephants, could be fed, paid, and kept ready because the entire kingdom had been bent around that requirement. Alauddin did not simply raise troops, he militarized the logic of the state. That matters because the Mongols, for all their brilliance, were also dependent on a habit that had worked for generations. They lived off movement and extraction. Their army did not drag enormous wagon trains like slower sedentary powers. It relied on horses dispersed, foraging plunder, and the capacity to turn fertile enemy land into moving supply. This was usually a strength. Kutlug Khwaja crossed into India expecting the familiar sequence: advance fast, terrify the population, strip the countryside, break any hasty defensive force that appears, move on richer ground. But once his men entered Alauddin's zone, something began to go wrong. The villages were empty, grain had vanished, herds were gone, storehouses were hidden or removed. What should have been a rich northern Indian landscape turned into deliberate scarcity. The transcript gets this right at the deepest level. The Sultan strangled the terrain itself. He did not wait for the Mongols to reach Delhi before trying to stop them. He began stopping them at the point where their speed required food. Every missing sack of grain was already a wound. Every abandoned village was already part of the battle. Inside Delhi, that logic was much harder to love. Nobles urged negotiation. Merchants begged for mercy. The city heard the same reports the countryside heard: burned settlements, shattered caravans, the return of that old impossible fear that the horsemen from the north were less an army than a curse. And amid that tension stood the most dangerous man on Alauddin's own side, Zafar Khan. This is a crucial piece of the story because great defensive systems are often endangered not only by the enemy outside, but by the hero inside, who mistakes courage for strategy. Zafar Khan was exactly the kind of general history loves to romanticize: brilliant, fierce, aggressive, the sort of commander who prefers decisive violence to patient control. He had beaten Mongols before by hitting first and hitting hard. For men like him, any delay looks like cowardice disguised as policy. But Alauddin needed a different war. He needed the enemy to starve, tire, and overextend before the kingdom risked its carefully built professional force in a battle that might undo years of preparation in one afternoon. The clash between the two men was therefore not just personal, it was philosophical. Zafar Khan believed in shock. Alauddin believed in systems. One wanted glory, the other wanted survival. Those are not always compatible. The plain of Kili near Delhi became the place where those two visions collided. The Mongols approached it with the old confidence of men who still trusted speed above all. The wind owned the open field. Their mounted archers spread like a fan, the classic shape of mobile domination. From a distance, they must have looked exactly like what they had always been at their best: fluid, numerous, impossible to pin down creatures of the open horizon. Yet the appearance concealed a growing internal weakness. Their horses were already tiring from days without sufficient forage. Their riders were living inside the effects of Alauddin's invisible siege. Hunger does not destroy an army only when men begin collapsing. It begins earlier in the weakening of draw arms, in the shortening of patience in horses, no longer willing to accelerate cleanly in commanders, whose freedom of decision narrows because the resource base under them is no longer stable. Kutlug Khwaja still had his army, but he no longer had it in full strength of function. That is one of the great strategic achievements of the Sultan's preparation. He made the battle start before the battle. Then came the first internal rupture. Against orders, Zafar Khan surged forward with his own division, essentially throwing himself at the Mongols in an impulsive act of aggressive defiance. The transcript presents him like a comet of disobedience, and that is exactly the right image. He embodied the old, irresistible temptation of commanders in a crisis to seize initiative with one magnificent strike and let legend sort out the consequences. Kutlug Khwaja saw the error at once. An isolated fragment of Delhi's army, unsupported and emotionally committed, was the kind of target Mongol doctrine was built to consume. Zafar Khan and his men were surrounded, showered with arrows, and destroyed in a whirl of mobile slaughter. His death was both tragedy and gift. Tragedy because he was brave and effective. Gift because his recklessness could no longer sabotage the larger strategy. That is a grim truth of command, rarely made beautiful in memory. Sometimes a rebellious hero dies at precisely the moment his death becomes useful to the survival of the state he meant to defend. Alauddin lost a dangerous subordinate and gained unified control over the battlefield. Now, the real structure of the battle emerged. The Mongols expected the sort of enemy they had so often beaten, one that would rush, fracture, expose itself, and give mounted archery room to work. Instead, they saw something profoundly alien to their expectations, a living wall of elephants. Here, the transcript's imagery of 700 living mountains matters not only as spectacle, but as psychology. To modern readers, war elephants can sound almost ceremonial relics of ancient exotic warfare. To steppe cavalry operating on half-starved horses, they were something else entirely. Moving towers of smell, noise, mass, and prehistoric pressure. Elephants armored in hardened leather, carrying archers, advancing not fast, but steadily, became less a charge than a change in the nature of the field itself. The Mongols were accustomed to enemies that could be made to chase, to turn, to run. Elephants do not run in that way. They impose. They do not negotiate emotionally with cavalry. They distort its instincts. Horses smell them and often choose fear before doctrine can intervene. That is why Alauddin's elephant course mattered so much. It was not merely a hard-hitting formation. It was a psychological contaminant introduced into the Mongol operational language. But elephants alone do not win battles. Alauddin understood that too clearly to trust them romantically. They had to be integrated into a wider structure, and that structure was infantry discipline. Flexible wings of infantry extended the line, joining beast to man tower to spear, shield, to tusk. This point is one of the transcript's strongest and should remain central. The Sultan did not seek a dramatic elephant stampede charging unsupported into steppe archers. He sought controlled pressure. The elephants would pin, intimidate, compress, and shatter direct assaults. The infantry would absorb infiltration attempts, close gaps, and prevent the Mongols from simply doing what they always did best: flow around the dangerous thing and kill the slower, soft parts. That is what made Kili so difficult for Kutlug Khwaja. Every time he looked for a flank, another disciplined section of Alauddin's army appeared to deny it. Every time speed tried to create freedom, the field answered with another obstruction. The plain was becoming a maze. The Mongols had come expecting open mathematics. They found controlled geometry. The first storms of arrows flew, black arcs against the sky descending on the elephant line. Some struck hides and armor and did little. Some angered the beasts. Some found men in the towers, but the effect the Mongols wanted did not arrive. The line did not break. The enemy did not panic. The elephants continued forward like deliberate pressure. This is the moment when the psychological center of battle began moving away from the Mongols. Their archery still killed. Their commanders still maneuvered. But for the first time in the campaign, they were having to prove that their old methods could still unlock the field. That is a subtle but critical change. Armies built around reputational supremacy become most vulnerable when the first minutes of battle do not confirm the inevitability they have long carried with them. Alauddin Khalji did what any competent Mongol commander would do. He tried the flanks harder. He sought to pull sections apart, open channels, exploit the slowness of elephants, and force Alauddin's formations to react faster than they could maintain coherence. Yet each movement met another layer of the Sultan's preparation. The infantry flexed and bent without dissolving. Elephants were not flung recklessly, but advanced under control, turning where needed, exerting pressure from angles that shortened rather than widened the battlefield. The key here is that Alauddin had not built an army dependent on spontaneous heroism. He had built one dependent on paid obedience training and ration-backed endurance. That is why the transcript's phrase, Delhi, was not fighting with fury, it was fighting with administration, is so powerful in substance. The men in his line were not improvising patriotism from thin air. They were parts of a machine kept fed and paid by the very economic system the nobles had called oppressive. In peacetime, his reforms may have felt like suffocation. At Kili, they became the invisible skeleton of resistance, and all the while, hunger kept working inside the Mongol host. This is the battle's hidden engine. Every additional maneuver cost energy they had less and less ability to replace. Their horses foamed and weakened. Bows were drawn by men who no longer carried the strength of the campaign's opening. Fatigue is not democratic in battle. It punishes the side most dependent on mobility first. That is why Alauddin's strategy was so coldly effective. He did not merely oppose Mongol speed with a defensive line. He eroded the physiological conditions that made speed a weapon in the first place. By the time Kili truly exploded, the horde was already fighting below its ideal self. Then came the great challenge. Whether from impatience, pride, or the need to restore the old hierarchy of terror, Alauddin Khalji ordered a massive direct charge. This was the crucial gamble. If the Mongols could smash the elephant wall, panic the infantry, and reopen the field, their whole operational identity might still reassert itself. The charge descended like a dark tide. Under other conditions, it might have been devastating. Here, it ran straight into a different world. Alauddin's elephants moved at the same moment, not as a wild stampede, but as a timed shock. The field convulsed. Horses were hurled aside or simply refused the collision. Tusk, trunk, armor tower, spear, screaming men and animals. The impact was not a clean military engagement, but a physical catastrophe. The transcript describes it as an earthquake, and that is the right register. Charges do not merely fail in such moments, they disintegrate. Once the front ranks of the Mongol cavalry lost order under elephant pressure, those behind crashed into a confused moving mass, where archery no longer had room and speed had turned into a liability. The living wall had done exactly what Alauddin required. It had made the enemy's greatest movement impossible. At that point, the retreat began, not yet a full rout, but the murmur of one. Kutlug Khwaja tried to gather a coherent corps and carve an escape route. That instinct was pure Mongol professionalism. If the first great blow fails, regroup, strike a weak point, restore motion. Yet even here, Alauddin had anticipated the logic. His left wing yielded and adjusted rather than cracking, functioning, as the transcript says, like a hinge and shield at once. That image matters because it reveals the sophistication of the Sultan's infantry training. These men were not static blocks waiting to be ridden around. They could absorb, give, reform, and let the elephant pressure from the sides turn a desperate Mongol thrust into entrapment. Space shrank. The elephants closed. The cavalry corps that still believed escape might be achieved found itself squeezed between walls of flesh and discipline. That is when the battle became psychologically final. The Mongols were no longer trying to win. They were trying to stop being enclosed. Kutlug Khwaja himself escaped, narrowly slipping through a gap between elephants, in one of the last fragments of Mongol mobility still functioning on the field. His survival matters because it preserves the judgment scene later in the story. The defeated commander carrying home not just news of lost men, but news of a new kind of enemy. But most of his army did not escape in any meaningful order. The retreat that followed was the retreat of men already defeated before they understood how to name their defeat. The elephants did not pursue like cavalry. They did something more demoralizing. They kept crushing, kept advancing, kept making the battlefield feel closed. Behind them came Delhi's infantry in controlled forward movement, not drunken with victory, not looting or scattering, but securing ground, clearing resistance, preserving formation. That, too, is vital. Alauddin did not let success infect his army with the very recklessness that had destroyed so many Indian forces in past encounters with steppe invaders. He advanced under control because he understood that the enemy, though broken, remained dangerous if given open disorder to exploit. When the smoke cleared, the scale of what had happened was larger than one battlefield result. Kutlug Khwaja had not simply lost a fight. He had discovered that India under Alauddin was no longer an inviting landscape for Mongol war-making. The kingdom had been turned into a system of denial, markets monitored, grain fixed, villages emptied in time, secret reserves protected, soldiers salaried, elephants maintained as strategic assets, not decorative beasts, watchtowers and patrols closing approaches, hidden depots ready for future campaigns. The transcript is strongest in its last third when it pushes this idea hard, because this is the real meaning of Kili. The Sultan understood that victory was not the clash itself. Victory was making the next invasion harder before the current one had even fully ended. That is why he did not celebrate wildly. He counted, he recorded, he fortified, he rotated troops, expanded the registration system, punished corruption, built deeper reserve networks, strengthened caravan supervision, and ensured that no future enemy would find a soft interior waiting behind the frontier. In other words, he turned a battlefield success into state doctrine. On the Mongol side, the aftermath was equally revealing. Surviving riders limped northward, not as the dust cloud of legend, but as a funeral procession. Horses weakened by lack of forage archers, so starved some had cut or consumed their own bowstrings. In desperation, officers gone or discredited, morale shredded. Kutluk Khwaja's report to the Khan was not the usual language of temporary setback. It was something more alarming. He had not been beaten by a braver charge or a luckier battlefield. He had been beaten by an enemy that fought with systems. That realization is historically enormous. The Mongol war machine had long thrived on the inability of sedentary states to respond coherently across the whole architecture of invasion. Alauddin answered not only with an army, but with an economy, a bureaucracy, and a territory already trained to deny itself in order to deny the invader. The Khan in the transcript's version does not respond simply with rage. He responds with study. That too is believable in deeper strategic terms. Great war cultures are forced to learn when they meet resistance they cannot explain away as mere weakness. India, at least in this moment, had become such a problem. And that is why Kili matters so much beyond its immediate tactical drama. It was not the story of one miraculous general charge or one exotic elephant spectacle. It was the story of a ruler who grasped earlier than most that the Mongol problem could not be solved by battlefield courage alone. Alauddin Khalji did something colder, and in the end, more intelligent. He made the whole kingdom part of the defense. He turned market regulation into military preparation. He turned scarcity into a weapon. He turned elephants into moving fortification. He turned paid professionalism into a line that would not panic. He turned patience into attrition. And by doing so, he struck at the essence of Mongol warfare. He did not just stop riders. He stopped the conditions that made riders overwhelming. That is the true secret weapon of Kili. Not a hidden blade, not a genius cavalry feint, not one furious champion in shining armor. The weapon was a state arranged for survival with such severity that even the greatest horde on earth found itself bleeding before the battle fully began. Many rulers want glory. Alauddin wanted endurance. Many armies dream of one heroic day. He built for years so that one terrible day would not destroy him. That is a much rarer form of greatness, and often a less loved one, because it asks a population to accept burdens before it can understand why they are necessary. Yet when the Mongols came, that burden became the wall that saved Delhi. And the field of Kili became the place where one of history's most feared military myths first learned that hunger discipline and absolute administrative control could be deadlier than speed.